Hey everyone, today I'm sitting down with Burley Kawasaki to talk about the future of CRM and no-code enterprise software solutions. Burley is the Global VP of Marketing and Strategy for Creatio, a leading no-code CRM company. I want to ask him about the state of enterprise software, where he sees this space going, and where Creatio fits in the mix. Let's jump in. Hey, Burley, thanks so much for joining us today. Super excited to have you on the podcast. Just to kick things off, I wanted to talk a little bit about, from your perspective, from Creatio's perspective, what does the state of CRM, what does the state of enterprise SaaS look like in 2025? What are you most excited about? Where are we going from here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. As I look at the CRM space, this can be a more exciting time, I think, because it's going through a complete reinvention, very similar to I think the reinvention it went through, 25 some years ago, where a lot of the incumbent enterprise CRM technologies, like Siebel and others, really got disrupted by SaaS, right? And SaaS was this entirely new value prop to customers. You didn't have to deploy it, you didn't have to install it, to upgrade it. It just was always available from the cloud, excuse me. And and for the last 25 years, I think it's been, a huge growth, driver for sort of the way customers would use and deploy enterprise software. Um, but I think we're sort of at the end of the era, so to speak, where I think a lot of the frustrations we've had about maybe this package, out of the box app that is hard to customize. I think we're seeing now how we're as a collectively as an industry really looking at how AI and also the use of no code really makes that a much simpler value proposition. The idea that I can just go to a prompt and I can create a customized, application in real time that meets my needs is an entirely different sort of value prop. And I think one that hits home and hits differently for a lot of, enterprises that maybe have been looking to try to find something simpler, easier than traditional SaaS. And that's really true of, I think, of CRM.
Right. So, along those lines, one of the more provocative statements I've started to hear out there is that, this blanket statement of like SaaS is dead, or, you kind of said that we're coming to the end of an era and that somewhere between low code, no code and agentic AI, what we've traditionally thought of as SaaS is changing. Do you buy that? Like, is it true? Is there truth in it? What does the path forward look like from your perspective?
Yeah, there's a saying that, people, overestimate the impact of technology in the short run, but then underestimate it in the long run. And I think, it'd be unwise to say it's dead, circa, 2025. I think we're seeing, especially in enterprise, that technologies have a longer staying power than we might think. Mainframes are still a big piece of a lot of enterprises these days, but their role has changed, right? I'll use the mainframe as an example because it's a good one. It became really a database or backend where you stored your data, but all of the processing power, the user experience, everything that was engaging the user, the customer really moved off first to the web, now to the edge device or the mobile device, now to an agent, right? And so I think the engagement experience is constantly sort of evolving and moving out. Sometimes the data, for a lot of good reasons, has to sort of stay where it is. There's such a center of gravity. And so I would expect that sort of traditional classic CRM will exist, but it becomes more the database that you've invested a lot of money into, and that the user experience that will change. And for a lot of, I think, very valid reasons. I mean, people generally, if I'm being a little bit, self-reflective, have found CRM hard to work with over the years, right? You had to put a lot of data, get entered into a lot of forms, and after pounding data into dozens or hundreds of forms, that really just gave you the starting point, right? What you did with it then in terms of, acting upon the data or doing something meaningful to your Salesforce or to your service desk, like that was really still incumbent on you. And I think that's where agentic really can unlock tremendous value because instead of just sort of being passively sort of sitting there, it actually is acting upon it in real time and proactively telling you what you should do as opposed to sort of putting the focus on the customer.
So it's super interesting, and I want to unpack that a little bit because there's so much wrapped up there, and as you said, it's not necessarily going away, but maybe there's this new experiential layer for users on top of it that makes it easier to unlock value. In your mind, what does that look like from a user perspective? And as you started answering, like, what does that unlock? Like, why should organizations be excited about this new frontier?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to be excited about, right? For the first time, really, software, has learned to work with us as opposed to the other way around, right? It used to be, that you had to go through all sorts of training and get your users enabled and rolled out, and that was just the starting point to really, again, getting adoption rolling. Now, the ability for software to speak our language, right, and to be able to converse in a natural format, I think is a tremendous, democratization of software in general, right? And so much of what was really restricted, I think, to really small numbers of trained users inside an organization, now we're seeing that potential to really, make that pervasive. In the same way that I think mobile unlocked access to technology, right? It wasn't just, oh, I had to be at my desk or have the latest laptop, but anyone with a device, right, could access the internet. Um, so I think we're seeing the experience just open up and touch, a much broader set of users through conversational paradigms. I think the challenges though is the speed at which users are comfortable with that will vary, right? The speed at which you or I might adopt, these newer AI and conversational experiences is probably different than, y- Joe down the road or Mary, in a different department, and it'll vary based on the industry they're in, the amount of regulation, their comfort level, right? There's a bunch of things that when I talk to customers, right, makes it very different. Some are moving at, 1,000 miles an hour. Some are moving at, 2 miles an hour, moving very carefully because they're not really comfortable with it. And so back to your question, I think one of the important things about the experience is that the experience should be driven by the user, right? And I should be able to determine how much or how little of this that it makes sense for me. And I think, we're still in this experimentation phase, but what you see a lot of times today in terms of the new announcements of the next bright shiny thing is sort of this assumption that everyone is 1,000% ready, and they're not, right? And that, oh, you need to move away from whatever my classic software was to this new agent driven software, and customers generally are not all ready at the same time for that. And so I believe it's more of a sort of software plus agents experience, right? And the degree to which I use one or the other is going to vary, not only based on my user preference in the industry, but potentially even, what work I'm doing or time of day, right? If I'm out, at Starbucks, it might be super handy in the morning when I'm getting ready to drive into the office to pull up my phone and have an agent summarize a bunch of tasks for me, right? So I can see all the customers I'm going to call on that day. But when I'm back in an office and I have two monitors, I can dock my laptop, having sort of a more efficient use of, those monitors and being able to see a lot of data, not in a prompt, but in a traditional dashboard or in a traditional application user experience might make more sense. So really throughout the day, I think your needs or your work styles will change. And I think that's one of the things that we as an industry haven't really I think understood yet was how it needs to personalize to the work we're doing, not just sort of assume that it's either agents or it's not. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Right. So it sounds like it's more kind of dynamic and predictive, and what do you need when, and how can it put together what's actually going to be most helpful for you in a
And if
given
AI is
context.
doing what AI is supposed to do, it's continuously learning and getting smarter.
Mhm.
And so again, it will know that, in the morning, back to my Starbucks analogy, I might want a certain type of information or level, but when I'm, in the office or when I'm out with a customer, right, it should adapt to me. And so I think sort of the self-learning capabilities of AI and sort of deep personalization and adaptation of the experience is something we don't see a lot, but is an important piece really
Mhm.
as we see this move forward.
If you work in IT, Infotech Research Group is a name you need to know. No matter what your needs are, Infotech has you covered. AI strategy? Covered. Disaster recovery? Covered. Vendor negotiation? Covered. Infotech supports you with the best practice research and a team of analysts standing by, ready to help you tackle your toughest challenges. Check it out at the link below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. You mentioned adoption and varying speeds and,
Mhm.
you know, adoption rates, I guess, readiness. And, you talk about some people moving 1,000 miles an hour and some people kind of, crawling
Yeah.
into it. In your mind, Burley, are they all going to the same place? Like, is there still the same kind of utopian or target destination, or do you expect some organizations are just going to say, you know what? No, I actually just want a piece of this, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, to be honest, most organizations don't know the answer to that question, right? I think I think everyone is investing and doing something in AI, and the data would prove this out. A lot of the analyst firms have done research looking, and everyone's got something in pilot, essentially, right? Everyone's doing something. They want to claim that they are learning and experimenting, but no one really knows how they're getting ROI out of their investments, or if they do, it's hard to prove. And I think there's more and more of the chasm, I think, being driven between the hype that's out there that you read every day, and the actual tangible value that you get back in. And so as I think we get a little bit further along, right, we'll realize, yes, it may be overhyped, but it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of really practical value that you can get. And so I think there's going to be the so-called trough of disillusionment, right, where we go through that, but as we come out the other side, people will have a little bit more uh, you know better understanding of exactly what are those use cases that, for me or for my industry, really unlock value. Right now, you can't go to a standard source, the analysts or otherwise, and say, okay, here are the top use cases for my industry or my business, my function, that are commonly deployed. I mean, you start to see some lists, but it's very early days still, and there's not a lot of proven science behind it of, okay, here are the ones that got the most ROI. But I think as we see that, and we'll see it quickly over the next 6 to 12 months, I think that will start guiding people to be more intentional. It's not just investing for the sake of checking the box and reporting up to the board that we are doing something, but really getting a better focus on, okay, here are the areas where it either is driving more efficiency in my business process, or creating some sort of differentiation in the market. I mean, people will get a little bit more focused on making those ties to ROI and value.
So within within this realm of no code or low code still, and unlocking this value, are you seeing, like, again, it's kind of a trope, but there's like the technology that exists, but then the harder piece is the whole organizational context and the people
Hmm.
and the processes around the technology needed
Yeah,
to unlock
yeah.
that. Um, my sense is that it's not just you know everything looks exactly the same, but there's like no code in the middle. It's that there's probably some organizational change required to really unlock the value of no code and low code. Um, what are you seeing that look like? And do you have any recommendations for how organizations should be, kind of adapting themselves to best take advantage of that?
Yeah. So, to answer the question, I'm going to sort of go back a little bit in time, so to speak, and just talk about no code and low code, simply because unlike the AI discussion that we were just having, low code and no code have been around for a while, and I think we've seen a couple of big shifts that have changed the way organizations structure themselves, and there's certainly many more examples of customers that have delivered significant value as a result of investments in low code and no code. I think the latest research I was looking at pegs it in sort of the 85-90% range of enterprises right now are deploying and using low code and no code, and that's a pretty high number, right? And why is that, is the question. I think what we saw is that it started out partly as an accelerant in the early days, to the IT backlog. So for quite a while, this was back when I actually started sort of some of my involvement in low code. It was mostly used by IT, and IT never has enough resources to get through
Hmm.
all the apps that they are being asked to build, and so they would use low code. It was still largely sort of a technical developer, maybe a less senior resource, but someone who had been through sort of software training, and they they were using low code to accelerate and get more done. Um, and then this interesting thing happened in 2020 called the pandemic, right? Which was this complete sort of disruption where suddenly now customers that had been sort of on the slow path to sort of digitize and trying to get things online, like it became an imperative. You couldn't do business without getting online, without having other ways of connecting, not just with your customer who couldn't visit you any longer in your physical presence, but also your teams were spread. And there's a lot written about the pendulum between, completely virtual and in the office, but it's much more distributed than it was 5 years ago. And that's, I don't think, going to change. And so when you have that kind of disruption, it actually was part of the gasoline that got thrown on the use of low code, no code technologies. But the interesting thing happened over the last 5 years was that it's now escaped well outside of just IT. And in the business, I think adoption has accelerated, and that's really, I think, what has driven sort of the separation between low code and no code. People sort of often jam them together as if they were one thing, but
Mm.
but they're very distinct. And when I talk about it, I talk about no code as being something that you don't have to be a developer. You're in the business. You're the so-called citizen developer, right? Who doesn't have formal training. You just have a business problem that you're trying to solve, and it could be in sales or marketing ops or in other parts of the business. They are increasingly picking up tools that help them get more done. And so over the last 5 years we've seen no code just accelerate as a separate, related but sort of separate sort of segment to low code, and that's taken off. And what you're now seeing is, well, that had sort of been happening before AI. The adoption curves of AI and no code are both intersecting as well, because there's so much excitement around AI, but there's so few people who are data science trained or know know how to pull down some of these newer frameworks or tools that are constantly being innovated on. They're amazing and powerful, but the vast majority of the people who want to use AI don't have the training, don't have the skills. And so I think for AI to realize its full potential, it has to be enabled via tools like no code that really democratize it out. Because the business is where, if you look at where we're going to see the most, I think, adoption and growth of AI, is it's going to be in the business. And the reason for
Hmm.
that is it's closest to their data, it's closest to their business process, right? It's not going to be something that's technically possible, but back to our discussion on how do you unlock value, how do you prove ROI, it's going to be the business figuring out, okay, how AI can get applied to shorten this process from 30 steps down to 5, or completely changing the business model. That's going to be possible, but it's only possible if they can use no code or other less challenging tools in order to drive that innovation. And so you see these sort of two converging trends, but I think the intersection is really important, because that's ultimately what is going to keep the democratization of AI
Hmm.
spreading. Um, so from a people and a process side, back to sort of the organization and the process structure, we have to, I think, organize, and we're seeing a lot of organizations find ways to create centers of excellence, right? That help spread out to the business, because you can't let the business just run amok, right? They're going to innovate at the speed that they need to, and then they're going to punch holes in firewalls. They're going to release data without you know thinking about it twice. They're going to create all sorts of challenges that, from the infosec and others perspectives, just you can't let that happen. And so I think there are some CIOs who their natural inclination might be to stop it, to prevent it from happening. But I think the more realistic and more progressive CIOs realize it's going to happen anyway. They can't control it, and so put in place a center of excellence model that partners and teams with the business, gives guardrails, so that rather than scouring the internet and just picking up random tools, they are empowered to have a toolbox that they can sort of pull cameras and the screwdrivers and other tools from, to very quickly build these applications. And when they do that, it's not slowing them down, it's enabling them, but it's doing it with, again, a selected, curated set of tools, and with guardrails in place that prevent them from going too far off the rails. So I think from a process standpoint, the COE investments, we see them today, and some of them are at pretty large scale with thousands or even tens of thousands of citizen devs. I think those are going to be becoming more and more common over the next, few years.
It's super interesting, and you went exactly where I was interested as well, Burley, which is the shape of the organization and what it means for like IT versus outside of IT as this like previously walled off skill set kind of seeps across the organization. And I love what you said there about CIOs and you know sort of embracing this and empowering it through centers of excellence. And so as we think about that, is that is that kind of the future of IT? Like, do we as do IT leaders need to start thinking about how more and more IT is distributed and embedded throughout the business, or are there like how do you see that particular space playing out?
Yeah. Well, there's the joke that CIO stands for career is over.
Years over, yeah.
Right. And, it's always, I've never actually been a CIO, but I can only imagine how stressful it is, right? Because you're constantly just sort of responding to all sorts of requests and outages, and you spend so much time on just keeping, service levels running for the core infrastructure that you don't always have time for the more strategic types of activities like we were just discussing. Yeah, honestly, I think there's sort of two possible paths or doors that a CIO can go through, right, as they think about the way they operate. One is to find a way to free up the time to be more strategic and to partner with the business and to do everything we just talked about, and that really expands their scope pretty significantly, right, beyond what a classic CIO has done. I think that's sort of door number one. Door number two is no, they continue to keep focused on the infrastructure. It's not really a negative statement, or it's a statement that, look, the modern infrastructures are really complex and hard, and you can't afford to underinvest in the proper cloud infrastructure, data infrastructure, AI infrastructure, and so there's a second doorway though that a CIO could go through, which is no, they really keep focused on that, and then that usually creates some sort of role like a chief digital officer or someone that is a little bit more external and business facing, that ultimately will own more of the new applications that are being built. And you see both of those common. Some CIOs have expanded their role, others are sort of coexisting, sometimes as a peer, or sometimes reporting into a CDO. I see both options available.
Do you think one option is better than the other for the organization, or do you think it just comes down to I guess, the fit and the ambition of the CIO?
A little bit of both. I mean, clearly, fit ambition plays a role, right? And so a lot of times it is steered by, the excuse me, the leaders you have in the organization today, because it's always, of course, challenging to go out and recruit an entirely new leader, and so you may try to optimize around sort of the leaders you have. I think it's hard, but it's certainly possible, in some ways advantageous, to have a single leader that can do both, right? And so
Hmm.
having sort of a dual speed uh, leader that can both focus on the keeping the lights on, keeping the infrastructure going, and at the same time really focusing on the strategic and the broader use of AI and digital. I That's a harder sort of formula to put together, of having all those skills together, the same leader, but really powerful when you can do
Hmm.
that.
Yeah. Do you think we're going to see at some point, not necessarily in 2025, but what I'll call a post-code IT department, where it's like, code is, I mean, you talked about this with mainframe. So maybe it's not that it's completely gone, but that it's, almost like a legacy tool, and most of what's being done in the organization and most of what's new is done without code. Like, is that realistic, or is that fanciful?
Um, well, certainly we are saying the amount of code is changing. Um, I don't know whether it will be completely post code, right? I think there's always a role and a need for writing code, but the type of code you're writing and where you write it is going to change. It's changed multiple times. I mean, no one writes kernel code anymore. You don't have to
Mhm.
worry about memory management. I mean, there's just a bunch of things that over the years a software, professional developer has sort of let get handled for them so they could continue to, focus on more creative or more challenging, engineering challenges. And I think that is true, right? We're already seeing, depending on who you believe, 50+% of code can be written by AI. And so a lot of that is replacing, at least today, a lot of the lower level infrastructure plumbing. I tend to believe, though, that the higher level design and artistry of software engineering, it's going to be quite a while before you can really replace that. I mean, maybe there's certain kinds of apps or very sort of narrow use cases. If you're just trying to create a form over data, sure, maybe that's pretty easy to replicate. But for a lot of applications that are doing something meaningful around your business and your business process, I think those are still going to require developers, but those developers are going to be increasingly sort of more designers and architects,
Hmm.
right? Because a lot of the time consuming, just I'm punching out a ton of infrastructure code. A lot of that will get taken care of, and you're going to be able to focus on making design trade-offs, trying to understand maybe more about composability. I think that's one of the things that I've learned personally from sort of the benefit of no code is, you know, yes, you're it's like Legos. You're composing a lot of things very visually, and you're pulling together, pre-built, components or UI
Hmm.
elements or etc. But at the end of the day, you unpack a component. Someone wrote code. It just instead of
Hmm.
you having to write it, the developer or someone who put a component in the marketplace wrote the code so you didn't have to, right? And I think that's the same that we're going to see around AI and coding, which is, there's still a lot of coding being written at various levels. It may be code written to train the AI model or, to help create sort of standards that the AI model will then know how to apply or replicate. But the assembler, sort of the integrator of all of this, they will spend less time on having to understand the lower level pieces, and they'll be more of a composer than anything else.
Makes sense. I'm just kind of chuckling at assembler is making me think of assembly and the whole thing kind
Oh
of
yeah,
coming full circle with
full
developers.
circle.
But it's not.
Everyone will be writing in assembly. It's just the
Yeah,
assembly will be,
exactly.
drag and drop. So
We're the assembly now. So if you're a developer, it sounds like you're not thinking as a developer you need to worry about like, okay, well, like, my career is over now because it's just like what I've done is completely commoditized. It sounds like there's as much or more opportunity than ever. It just has a slightly different shape than it did before.
I think that's true. Now, you know, certainly the job profiles will change a lot, but I mean, developers are kind of used to that, right? I mean, there aren't as many COBOL programmers out there as there used to be. Aren't as many sort of, fat clients, Win32 programmers as used to be. And so developers, I think, are used to a growth mindset and constantly sort of, reinventing their skill set professionally and learning new tools. And I think that is certainly true here. Now, it's moving at a speed that maybe is faster than we're used to, right? And we're seeing, I think, that create a lot of challenges. But in general, I think the developer community, right, of any sort of profession is used to sort of retraining and continuous learning because the technology, is never still.
Right. No, it makes sense. So let's talk about the organizations you're working with, and how you enable them. What sorts of organizations tend to be, good fits for you, or seek out Creatio and what you're doing?
Yeah, and it runs the gamut. I would say, we tend to focus on so we define as the corporate to enterprise. So we have customers in sort of SMB, but that's not really where we serve. I think in the SMB space, again, they tend to, have is just lesser complexity, and so the sometimes the advantages in the sort of the value you get from a platform like Creatio's, you know, they may not need yet as they
Mm.
grow, perhaps. But I think we see as the sweet spot where organizations have started to, acquire, multiple SaaS applications. They've got a more complex business process. It's unlikely that they could just adopt one SaaS application that sort of fits all their needs. They're starting to work in a little bit more of a heterogeneous sort of world. And so that's where I think Creatia's ability to sort of provide a platform that helps with sort of the, automation and orchestration, in particular for sort of what I call the front office, right? So CRM plus sort of all the workflows that surround that is an important piece, but not exclusively. I mean, we have customers that are using us, you know, in far-flung industries well outside of sort of classic CRM, and I think that goes to sort of just sort of maybe the value of no code in general, right? If you have a process for a custom app, you can build it on Creatio, but I think we see its intersection of companies that have a certain set of process complexity and size. They need to orchestrate processes, and then once they get to that, they also start realizing that they can't. Um, Having lots of different tools is harder and harder to pull off, right? Just because of, as especially as the business starts picking up, multiple different tools for either building app or designing processes, it becomes harder to manage, harder to govern. And so there tends to be sort of this natural point where they want to consolidate into sort of a single platform that allows them to build and deploy. And that's especially true, I think, with AI concerns being overlaid, right? Because if every group is sort of doing something different with their data and AI, it creates a lot of governance challenges. And so I think, today we see a lot of point solutions being adopted, but I think you're going to see inevitably a consolidation, right? And that's why we're sort of, I think, really focused on and betting on building sort of a single unified platform that covers not just one use case or one style of AI or one type of business process, but that really helps you cover a very broad set. Enterprises want that. Now, at the very high end of the spectrum, if a Fortune 50, Fortune 100, you've got big enough IT teams. Arguably, they can build everything in house. They don't have to worry about that. But most organizations, sort of in that middle range, don't have ever the volumes of IT to keep up with the pace, and so they tend to look for easy to adopt, easy to use, single platforms that take them, a lot of the way there to developing and innovating what they want to.
I'm I'm glad you brought up IT, and this has been a thread we've been tugging on this whole time. That there's the embedded in the business units, uh, you know, citizen developers. We've got IT in the mix. That the people that come knocking on your door that have this need or want to unlock this value, is it typically CIOs? Is it typically IT folks, or is it typically the business leaders who kind of recognize this as being an issue and appreciate, the type of solution that you bring to the table?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I would say, of course, it depends or it varies. But what we see probably more frequently is someone coming from the business, right? So it's a chief
Hmm.
revenue officer or chief marketing officer. It's usually a C level of some type, but usually they are the one who feels the pain. Oftentimes, IT has deployed a sort of legacy CRM package or some other tool, some other stack, and it's not sufficient. And so they are, the business is the one driving. Okay, there should be a better way. And so they will make sort of first contact with us, and we will help educate them. We'll help with understanding their needs and sort of try to prove or demonstrate that we are the right fit. Inevitably, though, IT will get involved at some point,
Hmm.
right? Governance, security, especially in this age of AI, are important considerations. So they will always get involved, but it's usually a business led investigation. And then once they make a decision and they've deployed us, what's interesting is sort of the roles that are involved in the initial deployment, and then the roles that are involved sort of on an ongoing or steady state. Usually, the first deployment has pretty close involvement with IT, again, because they're wanting to validate security, they're validating the infrastructure. The first, few interfaces that they may need to build or implement a pre-built connector to usually takes coordination from IT, right? But once that is done and deployed, then the incremental effort to create a new business process or a new application then becomes self-service. right? And it becomes easier and easier then for the business teams to be fairly self-sufficient. Um, an example that I always think about is, and they're a fairly common example. We do a lot of work in banking and financial services, and there's a credit union that is a customer of ours. They're pretty good size. They're about a $10 billion assets credit union, which makes them, you know, sort of like top 25 in in the U.S. So
Mm,
bigger than your average credit union, but still, they their need that they highlighted was actually started in marketing and was outside of IT. And to this day, they maintain, they've built, a whole suite of applications running on Creatio. They've deployed it to 3,000 plus users across sort of every credit union function, that's sort of member facing. So, if you call their service center, or you walk into a branch, or any of the customer touch points, they ultimately power all of the process and the workflow using Curatio. These three, thousand plus users are all supported by a team of three, and those three are not
mm.
in IT; they are still inside the business, and that sort of shows, like, again, how sort of lean and very sort of productive or efficient these teams can be, right? Yes, again, it took IT involvement to get everything set up, and the first time, right, there was a lot of hand holding, but now the business teams are very productive, and I can point to a lot of examples like this.
No, I love that story, and it's so it's so illustrative of what this looks like and why it's so different from what you've got, just in kind of a traditional SaaS world. And so
Yeah.
I just along those lines, Burley, I'm always interested in the war stories and the use cases. Do you have any like, kind of coolest or craziest use cases you've seen where, customers did something that maybe is even beyond what you envisioned or thought of what this could be for, or it was just, you found really, really impressive?
Yeah. Well, I think, some of those use cases, like I said, are sort of the ones that stretch well outside of traditional CRM. The focus on CRM is not a technical limitation for us. It's more of a realization that, we had to focus as a company. So if you go back to the time machine, Cratio actually started off first as a no-code platform vendor, predating the building of our CRM apps. But turns out it's hard to grow as an early stage company, and serve, all types of buyers, all
Mm,
types of use cases. And so you have to sort of focus. And so early on, to her credit, the CEO Catherine picked, sort of CRM in the front office, something that had a very defined set of use cases. There's a high interest in customizing and personalizing and differentiating the customer experience, and so no code and sort of CRM were very closely aligned. And so, the rest is history. We've grown very rapidly with that focus, but, still plenty of partners, still plenty of customers that walk up to Creation and say, I'm not even, using, y- you know, uh, you for CRM. In fact, I may be using Salesforce, or, other CRM vendors, but I see it so compelling that, we're going to build these amazing apps on top of Creatio. And so one example that I think about, they've been a fairly long time customer for like 5 years, I think now, but the country of Israel implements and runs all of their sort of their infrastructure management in road construction projects. So there's, tens of thousands of sort of these projects that are running simultaneously across the whole country, right? And so this is a pretty mission critical application set of applications that's automating all these functions, and it has virtually nothing like you look at the application, you'd be hard pressed to say it's CRM related. I mean, maybe you could sort of squint at it, but it's really it's their backbone application that powers the entire infrastructure projects. There's billions of dollars of spend annually that is managed by this. It's essentially their system of record to for any infrastructure project across the country. So that's an example. Now
yeah.
they're not typical. Like, again, I would say there's certainly a lot more that are doing something that's more CRM related, but that's more of a focus of our go to market than anything.
Oh, it's super cool, and gives me a sense of the breadth of like what your solution can do. And I mean, it's all helpful to understand that CRM. I can understand why you might want to sell to a chief revenue officer, because they're probably going to have the budget and the need, and the value that can be unlocked for front office is really, really impressive. But just the value of no code across the organization and what can be unlocked there.
It, and it is meaningful to them not only because of the value they create for the organization, but also, as we talked about, they typically are underserved from a technical skills perspective, and so it's
Mhm.
sort of the double intersection of very well defined business need, urgency, plus also no code sort of democratizing the ability for them to really be in charge of their own destiny. I think it's really that convergence that makes, working with people that are customer facing in sales, marketing, service really a powerful combination, and why we've seen so much demand.
Got it. Burley, I wanted to ask you, for organizations, or call it organizational leaders who aren't heavily invested in no code right now, what's your best advice for how they should be thinking about this opportunity space, what they should be doing differently that can maybe help them take advantage of the opportunities that are presenting themselves today and tomorrow?
Yeah. Well, this is going to sound a little self-promotional, but we no 3 years ago we were struggling with that because you know uh, the people that are wanting to get started with no code, they haven't gone through traditional training. They don't know what an agile process looks like. They don't know Scrum. All the things that you sort of can rely on people having been trained on if they come from IT, they come from a software background. And so this was actually before I joined Creatio, but I was independently advising and consulting a number of high tech firms. I happened to connect with Catherine, Creatio CEO, and we saw that there was a need to really prepare and enable sort of the business leaders to go down and start this journey. And so we wrote a book together called the No Code Playbook, which was, I look back and it's one of those things that I sort of I compare it to having children, right? It's a lot of work. You spend 9 months, slaving away, and by the time you're done, you're exhausted. It's like never again. Then enough time goes by, and it's like, well, maybe that was sort of a fun experience. And so we just released the second edition to this book, and it was done because of really the whole emergence of AI.
Hmm.
When we first wrote the book, 3 years ago, I mean, AI existed, but people thought of it in a much more narrower sense than they do today, and so we had to update a lot of the content. But the playbook, again, it's agnostic. It is not a Creatio marketing piece in that you can use it with really any no code technology. It's meant as a primer to no code, but it basically talks about the people, process, and technology sort of concepts that you should be thinking about as a business leader. And so it walks you through how do you organize a no code team? How do you structure a project, right? What are the phases in a no code application development lifecycle, right? All the, again, concepts we sort of took, 40 years of software development, tried to reimagine and adapt them down to this no code world and make it something that, could be picked up and read in, a short amount of time. So no code playbook, it's out there. It's
Awesome.
available. You can get it off of Amazon, but you can also just go to the Creatia website and you can sign up and get a free copy as well. So,
It's amazing, and it's a super, super cool book that you've got there. Now we talk about 40 years of software development. You mentioned business leaders. Who is this book for? Like who do you find are the people and the roles that are really getting the most value out of this?
um, yeah, there's sort of three levels of roles that we thought about. We tried to write this for. There was sort of the stakeholder for a no code project, right? Typically, someone who's a business leader, someone reasonably senior inside organization, but not so senior that you weren't you sort of feeling the pain of like lacking the right skills or resources. So mid-level director, GM type of individual in the business. So that was sort of persona one. Persona two was then the sort of actual citizen dev themselves. We called it a no code creator, but someone who would be actually a practitioner, right? That would need to pick up tools and build their first no code app. And the third one, and we didn't get as deep initially into this persona, but really was this notion of a business architect, right? Someone that had a little bit more technology depth, but wasn't in IT. And so you see these sort of, I think Gartner calls them business technologists that sort of sit in between the two worlds. And they're increasingly important because they know enough about technology to know what can be composed. And so back to, assembling, not building, right? They tend to be the ones who know, okay, I can pull all these parts together, and then they work with the business, folks inside their team to understand how do those meet or get adapted to the business process. So those are sort of the key roles um, we focused on. Interestingly, when we released it, you of course you then get a lot of follow-up feedback. People want different kinds of
Mm.
detail, and so we also released an online companion to the playbook, something we call the No Code Toolkit. Again, you can go to the Creatia website, and this is a evergreen site. We're updating it regularly, but that one is more aimed at the practitioner. So if you read the playbook, gives you a good intro. You'll probably only read it once though, right? It gives you the primer, where the toolkit is meant as sort of an everyday reference guide. And so that tends to be much more squarely in terms of you know, the citizen dev, the project manager, someone who's really in the weeds and so to speak about how they should go about building. And so it gives a lot more templates, hands-on practical advice, guides to estimating your project, things like that that make it very relevant and useful to a no-code team.
So, as I think about that playbook and, who's using it, what it looks like, how you implement it, it very much gives me this flavor of being in some way the next agile, right? Or fitting in the same world as agile did, 15 or however many years ago. Do you buy that comparison, or is there something inherently misleading about it?
No, we actually use that comparison as a mental framework. The better, in some ways, example though is, um, think about when Agile started initially, and it was great for sort of these small teams, the garage teams that could pick it up, and then when enterprises started adopting Agile, they started realizing, okay, it doesn't necessarily meet all the needs of an enterprise well. Enterprises think about portfolios of applications that you're building simultaneously, and there's more complexity in program management and governance. And so there's this effort that, if you're in the Agile community, you're familiar with, called SAFe. It's a scaled Agile framework, right? And to go out to SAFe, it's a wonderful site. A longtime user of their practices. What they've done is they've created a bunch of sort of, I'll call it, extensions to Agile that make it very relevant for using it at scale by the enterprise, right? Not as a startup, not as sort of, small, 10-man teams, but if you've got hundreds of people that are using Agile, you have to sort of think about it in a different way. And so I think about this. We also build on a lot of Agile concepts. It's not like this you know, is completely foreign from Agile, but we've tried to again adapt it to thinking about the needs of the enterprise. And as you start, delivering it at scale by teams of citizen developers, back to again, if business teams are just going to start picking this up, and you're going to eventually get to, maybe not today, but eventually you get to a center of excellence type model, right? What do you need to have in the methodology so that you can scale up um, as your needs scale up, right? No code, you know, I mean, I'll pick a tool, a very popular tool at the sort of the more the SMB and indie side, something like Bubble, right? Bubble is hugely popular. Lots of startups have built on Bubble. Very few enterprises are building their enterprise applications on Bubble, right? You wouldn't see the country of Israel building their mission critical app on Bubble. And it's not so much even that it couldn't, but you just lack the guidance, you lack the structure for how you think about sort of those types of enterprise concerns. And so, we knew that with our focus on the enterprise and with the belief that this was going to pervasively scale as more and more business teams inside enterprise pick up our platform, that we had to have prescriptive sort of approach and guidance and practices to help make that successful. Otherwise, you could do the first couple of applications on Gratio and then, you know, run off the cliff, not because the technology wasn't supporting you, but you may lack the expertise, you may lack the process, you may not be sharing practices effectively. And so the playbook was an attempt to try to get ahead of the the growth and adoption that we believed would be happening and is happening now. So in hindsight, it was very important sort of investment we did 3 years ago to help ready for the customer and the types of scale deployments we're seeing now.
Got it. No, that's super helpful, and I love that comparison, and it helps me, kind of frame the entire thing, with a reference point that I understand. Burley, that's all the questions that I had prepared for today. Is there anything we didn't talk about?
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. I think, I'll maybe just sort of circle back to where we started, which was, you know, I think we're seeing this amazing sort of once in a generation sort of transition with AI, right? And it's more than just another feature. It's more than just another, add-on to to a product we have. We fundamentally see this as requiring a shift in mindset. And the best way I sort of explain this is like when people move to the cloud, 15 years ago or whenever, their initial response was, okay, we're just going to hoist our physical servers up to a VM and we're in the cloud, but we are not cloud native, right? And it took a sort of a bit of understanding that to truly be cloud native, required a different sort of strategic architecture built on microservices, built on sort of changing the way you thought about building and delivering applications. And so when I think about AI, it requires an AI native approach as well. And so we've been, I think, really thinking hard about this and anticipating sort of that. And that's a lot of where we're going just from our own product. But I would say as the industry sort of collectively, I think matures, it's going to be important to really understand what that AI native application model looks like, right? Not just I've got all these, one-off sort of cool AI technologies, but think about more from, again, what's your application model, your application framework look like that will continue to, I think, really deliver on the promise of that. And so that would be maybe my final thought is don't just sort of think about it as an add-on,
Mm,
a bolt-on to sort of your existing sort of suite. Think about it as a reimagining opportunity deeply so that you can really take advantage of AI across your applications.
I love that. So it's not just about, how do we move to a new technology with our existing processes? It's how do we change our mindset and completely reimagine it?
Many processes will change dramatically, right? We've started
Yeah.
seeing this where things that used to take, weeks and months now are hours or days, right? Just because AI is doing a lot of the data entry, the data, the heavy lifting. It's taking things that humans are not good at and really offloading that and doing it at warp speed. So I think the process redesign in this whole AI native world is something that, importantly critical as you're experimenting to really be understanding that and understand how you can use that for your advantage.
Amazing. And it's super exciting. It's a super exciting platform. It's a super exciting time. Burley, I want to say a big thank you for joining us here today.
Of course. Yeah. No, my
Awesome.
pleasure. Thanks for having me.